What is the biggest mistake people make when they are trying to communicate their work?
Keep the slides simple and clear and make each slide convey a point. And I think that's especially important when you're talking to a general audience. I mean, putting up a bunch of autoradiograms or something like that, these multi-panel figures, right, with all these different things on them. I think just completely, even a scientific audience will glaze over. Their eyes will start to glaze over, and for a lay audience, that they're just going to get completely lost. But I'll just say one other thing though, which is that I was going to mention this in the previous context, but one of the things I've noticed with scientific writing, and so I'm going to talk about writing, but I think it applies to speaking as well, is that I've noticed that a lot of times scientists write these sentences that sound scientific, but they're saying almost nothing, right? All the words, they're filled with all the words. And I think the reason that this happens is that scientists, if you write a lot, if you do a lot of writing of grants and papers, you get very good at sort of assembling out of these prefabricated phrases together, right? You know what I mean? The phrases are already preformed. You assemble them together when you don't know what you really want to say. You know what I mean? You think there's something you want to say or some conclusion you want to reach, but you're not really sure what it is, but you can still generate these sentences that sound like they're saying something, but they're not really saying anything. And when I write and I encounter myself doing that, what I usually do is I stop myself and I say, okay, what are you really trying to say here? And what I usually realize is that I actually don't know what I'm trying to say. I mean, I'm generating a sentence because it's easier to generate a sentence than it is to actually think really, really hard about what it is I want to say. And if I know what I want to say, then usually I can say it using normal words. I don't need to use these jargony, phrases. And so I think the same thing, I think the same thing applies to speaking, right? Think really hard and clearly about what it is you're actually trying to say. And if you do that, I think the words will, you'll find the right words that don't require you to sort of fall back on sort of empty jargony phrases.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I would add that one of the mistakes that we commonly make, because we're in the lab doing research, we're talking about our work to our colleagues, we tend to be focused on the technical details, right? And there's a sense that, yeah, even like Dave was saying, if you put up a slide with your entire Western blot and all the different bands that you're not going to talk about, you only care about this one band, somehow it feels like, oh, look, I did this big experiment, so I'm going to impress people with what I did. Um, and sometimes it's unintentional, right? It's just, well, I know that if I show this to you, you're going to want to see the positive control and the negative control, and you're going to want to see the loading control, and so I'm going to put all that stuff up. I'm not going to talk about it, but any decent scientist would want to see those things. But I think that's the mistake. It's to think that the details that matter to you when you're doing the experiment are going to matter to your audience when you talk about it. They should just assume, and maybe it's a bad assumption, but they should assume that you knew what you were doing. And when you present it, it's going to be, what does this mean, right? What's the big picture from the so-called forest for the trees, right? Who cares about the trees? What matters is the scene from the top of the mountain.
Yeah, I think that's really good observation. I agree. One thing sort of related to that, I was thinking about in this context as well as, and this is probably a reflection of my, the fact that I'm not a very good scientist, but one thing that really bothers me is when people put up, this is more like in science presentations, not for presentations for the general public, but like I go through this a lot, like in candidacy exams and stuff. The students will put up these data figures that are using some presentation, some method of presentation that's very idiosyncratic and arcane, right? It's something that people within that field, it'll be some picture with lots of colors and things on it, and it represents something. And they'll just put it up there and they'll say, well, of course, this shows this. And I have no idea what's going on. And I don't expect them to spend 15 minutes explaining what this is, but I wouldn't mind 2 sentences explaining what it is, right? And so, and then after a while, I'm just completely flummoxed by what's going on, and then they just keep right on going. They say they'll show this incredibly complicated graph or a figure with all of these images that I don't know what any of them are. And then they'll say, well, and of course, this shows this. And then they go to the next slide. And I'm thinking, I have no idea what's going on here. So, and then I'm supposed to formulate a question, right, based on that, like a candidacy exam question based on a graph that I completely didn't understand in the first place. But I think that that's relevant to speaking to scientists. But when it comes to, again, speaking to the general public, I think you really have to boil it down to, a clear, expression of what the point is that you're trying to make,
Yeah, and I think it gets at that same issue of the graph that you put in your paper is meant to show all your data, but the graph that you put in a talk is meant to show the conclusion, right?
Yeah, I agree. One thing, this is off topic again, but, I did that a couple years ago. I did that TED Talk thing, right? And one of the things that was weird about that was that you're standing at a podium and you're looking out at an audience and your slides are behind you, right? And so this is one of the first times in my life, in a long time, that I had to give a talk without being able to stare at either my computer or at the slides. And it was really hard. It's actually really hard to do that if you're not used to it, because we're so used to saying, okay, here's the next slide. Now I know what I'm supposed to talk about next. And without that crutch, you feel pretty naked. That's how I felt. I felt naked up there. I felt, what if I just completely forget what I'm supposed to say? What if I just draw a blank, So, and I think for your students giving these presentations, it's probably going to be more like that. They're going to have to kind of be up there and know what they're going to say, right? They're not going to be able to just keep falling back on their slides.
And I guess all really good talks are super practiced like that people know, even the timing down to a fine detail. But if it's a really good talk, it doesn't feel like that happened. It feels like it's just a conversation, even though you knew where it was going from the beginning.
Yeah, when I was younger and I used to put a lot more work into talks than I do now, I used to practice and practice and practice and practice them. And then I would practice trying to make them sound like they weren't over practiced. But I'd actually try to work on making sure that it didn't come off like I was just reading it. Now now at this point, I don't put any effort in, So, I find like with Physiology 209, that big class I teach, I almost find it a challenge to not think about what I'm going to say at all until I show up. Right. Just because, just to see if I can remember what I'm actually talking about. But I don't think I wouldn't recommend that for your,
No.
I wouldn't not recommend that. That's just because I've gotten lazy over the years. I wouldn't recommend that for your NeuroLingo speakers. I think they should actually know what they're going to say before they go up there, and not just figure they're going to wing it for 10 minutes.
Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
When you were saying that, what came to my mind is how we started this conversation. The idea that as scientists, it's not just our job to do science. We really have this obligation. We're getting all this money from the government. We're getting all this. People are spending a lot of time training us, and then we're working in the laboratory using really cool equipment. It's a privileged life we live, but in fact, we have an obligation, right? And our obligation isn't just to publish papers. It's really to take that knowledge that we've obtained and transmit it to the public that's funding us. So it's not just that we're, don't just do it for fun. Do it out of a sense of responsibility to the community. Give something back.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's absolutely right. I just to kind of reiterate what Ed said. I think first of all that we have, a responsibility to convey to the public, who are after all, supporting the research, what we're doing and why it's valuable. I think that we have an obligation to do that. So that's the first thing I would say as a call to action. And the second thing I would say is it's actually a really fun, rewarding thing to do, right? So, there's something very satisfying about explaining your work to people and getting people excited about it, and people who don't know anything about what you do, but the people are really, really curious. They really do want to know what's going on in these neuroscience labs, and it's rewarding and fun and exciting to explain it to them. So, as Ed said, I think we have a responsibility to do it, and it's also a rewarding thing to do.
And if you're going to do it, might as well do it well.
Yeah, and it's a skill. It's a skill it's one of the skills that you need to develop, I think, as a modern scientist.